It is the story in Malaysian politics that just doesn't go away. The opposition leader, Anwar Ibrahim, twice accused of sodomy, convicted, and now he's lost his last chance at an appeal. Is it a just verdict or political character assassination? And why has this gone on for so long? This is Inside Story. Hello everyone, I'm Kamahl Santamaria. For many people, when they hear the name of Malaysia's opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim, it isn't elections or policies that come to mind. It's more to do with controversy, career turbulence and sexual allegations that keep resurfacing. The thing is, Anwar was once considered a rising star in the country's ruling party. He in fact rose as high as Deputy Prime Minister, but was sacked and then arrested soon after and accused of sodomy and corruption. This time, though, Anwar's political career may be over. He was sentenced to 5 years in jail last March after being convicted of having sex with a male aide and has now lost an appeal against that conviction. Anwar and his supporters insist the case is politically motivated, designed to destroy the career of a man once considered by some to be the greatest threat to Malaysia's political establishment. All of this does need some explaining because the whole Anwar Ibrahim controversy actually goes back around 17 years. So stay with me on this one. As we mentioned, he was Deputy Prime Minister back in 1998, but was sacked after a disagreement with the Prime Minister at the time, Mahathir bin Mohamad. That is when the accusation started. Anwar was arrested on sodomy and corruption charges and was later sentenced to 6 years in jail for corruption. And when prosecutors tried to extend his sentence by 9 years for sodomy, a court overturned them and Anwar was freed from prison in 2004. But then we go 4 years later, the charges came back. Anwar was accused of sodomizing a male former aide, but was then acquitted another 4 years later in 2012. Then in 2013, he led the opposition alliance in what was the strongest ever challenge to the ruling coalition in Malaysia. But still, the controversy returned. An appeals court overturned Anwar's early acquittal in March 2014, sentencing him to 5 years. He then appealed, but the conviction was upheld on Tuesday, which brings us right up to the present. So, in short, we have a sentencing which was overturned, fresh charges which Anwar was later acquitted of, but which were also overturned, and now this failed appeal. What has it all achieved? Let's introduce the panel for today, all in the Malaysian capital, Kuala Lumpur. And we start with Nurul Issah Anwar, who's a Member of Parliament and the daughter of Anwar Ibrahim. Chandra Muzaffar is a political scientist and former Deputy President of the National Justice Party with Anwar Ibrahim many years ago. And also joining us, Bridget Welsh, Senior Research Associate at the Centre for East Asia Democratic Studies at the National Taiwan University. Thank you to all of you for joining us on Inside Story, and I'd like to start with you, Nurul Issah Anwar. Your father was very confident on Monday when Al Jazeera interviewed him that he was going to be set free. That hasn't happened. What was it that made you or him and his supporters think it was going to be different this time? This has gone on for so long. Why did you perhaps feel it might be different?
I think clearly in this particular instance, the law and the arguments were just so clear-cut. And like I stated earlier, based on my father's statement, even if it was a just process, we definitely would have seen an acquittal. So yes, it's come as a shock, but in his previous conviction in the year 1999, the International Bar Association found that his conviction was influenced by the executive in Malaysia. So for me, it hasn't come as a surprise, but it really vindicates our allegation that he's a victim of a grand political conspiracy.
Well, this is what we keep hearing, politically motivated, politically motivated. Just expand on that for me, if you would, please. Do you think that people just want him out of politics, just want him out of the game at any cost?
Well, you know, he has been no stranger to incarceration. And since 1999, of course, at the time, he was seen as a threat to Mahathir bin Mohamad, the then Prime Minister. You know, he was slapped with these charges, sodomy, and of course, corruption that did not involve any financial amount at the time. So for me, you are looking at the collaboration or the involvement of not just the police force. You're also talking about the Prime Minister's office. The Prime Minister himself was seen to be involved with the then accuser or the accuser in this particular case. So all this adds up, yeah, to a sordid base for allegations that there are clear problems with regards to transparency and the independence of the judiciary. So for me, you know, we have documentation by International Bar Association, International Commission of Jurists. I've gone to Geneva to attend a Human Rights Commission when I was a lot younger, and time and again. So, you know, in sum, you know, the government of the day has continued to perceive him as a threat, especially in the last general elections when we, the opposition, garnered up to 52% of the popular support. So you can imagine, Anwar Ibrahim will continue be bringing nightmares to the current regime of Barisan Nasional and UMNO.
Chandra Muzaffar, let me bring you into the conversation now. As I understand it, your belief is that justice has been served here. The process has gone through and this is how it should have been. How do you react or respond to what you heard from Nurul?
If there was a conspiracy against Anwar, he could have exposed that conspiracy very, very easily. All he had to do was to offer his DNA sample to the court process. He could have said, well, this is my DNA sample, match it against the DNA sample that you have. And he could have destroyed the case of the prosecution. In fact, he could have destroyed the government itself if he was able to show that the whole thing was fabricated.
Okay, but I'm reading something here from Human Rights Watch which says DNA samples that were central to the prosecution's case had not been handled or maintained properly and thus were possibly contaminated. And a High Court judge said, you know, the only other thing there was uncorroborated victim statements. So they kind of threw that out there in the first place and it was down to those victim statements in the end.
Well, if I could respond to that, you know, the DNA measurement used in Malaysia is one of the highest in the world. In terms of DNA numbers, it is 16 out of 16 matching points, which is higher than the United States of America or Britain. And it was shown very clearly that the sample that the prosecution had, semen, which is far more reliable than sweat, was not contaminated at all.
Right, so the short story is that you're going on just the evidence alone. You don't believe in any political motivation whatsoever here?
Well, even if there was a political motivation, I think the overriding factor that has to be considered is this, that as far as a criminal trial of this sort is concerned, Anwar did not fulfill certain very basic requirements of a trial of this sort. Number one, the DNA specimen that I just mentioned. Number two, he offered no alibi, which I think is very critical. At the beginning, he said that he was going to do it, but the moment the CCTV footage came out, he was not prepared to proceed with his alibi theory. And number three, if you look at what has happened in the thing, in his 1998 trial, Anwar submitted his evidence from his witness box, and therefore he was cross-examined. But this time, he chose to do it from the dock, and as a result of that, he was not cross-examined. In fact, he did not want to be cross-examined. Now, in a case of this sort, you're not prepared to be cross-examined, you cannot offer any alibi, you're not prepared to get your DNA tested, and you expect to be acquitted?
It's interesting. We'll come back to Nurul's answer to that in a moment. I just want to bring Bridget Welsh into the conversation now, just to, I guess, sum up what we've heard from both of our previous guests there. One's talking about political motivation, the other one's talking about a legal process and DNA evidence. What do you feel about it all?
Well, I think the fact that there is clearly a perception in Malaysia that this is political. And I think sometimes it's not necessarily about whether or not it is or it's not, because there are different opinions on that. But what is the overriding perception among people? And this is not the first trial. It is the second. In fact, he's been in jail for 3 times. And there is a clear perception that the opposition leader is being targeted. Very few people are charged for sodomy in Malaysia. There are legitimate questions by the international community of lawyers and human rights community about certain aspects of the trial. Those have been mentioned already by others in terms of the handling of the evidence, the issues in terms of the whole process of prosecution, the back and forth in these issues, and the fact that this has gotten so much political attention, including from the Prime Minister's office, who issued a statement about this shortly after the verdict was out, before even sentencing. I think there is a high politicization of this case, and it does have important political consequences for the country, because it affects not only the opposition, but it also affects the Prime Minister himself, because he is being perceived as being responsible for this. Now, whether or not he is or not is another question, all right? And those things are very difficult to prove, but the public perception is there that he is responsible. And those things actually mean a lot in the context of Malaysia, because you have a situation where this has been going on for over 17 years. They're taking down each other for personal attacks, using the judiciary in this process. It's not moving the country forward in a way that is actually trying to solve some of the fundamental problems that the country is facing.
Just quickly go back to a point you made about not seeing many people in court over charges like this. I mean, do you have any idea of numbers or proportions? Because it's a very particular sort of charge to go after, a very particular sort of accusation.
There have been some cases, but not that many. And I think one of the things that's very important is this particular case aimed at delegitimizing Anwar Ibrahim's moral position in the society when it was first initiated in 1998, 1999 by Mahathir, who, as he was challenging Mahathir. I mean, I think it's not a coincidence that, one doesn't need to be a rocket scientist that the minute the opposition leader becomes a clear challenge to the incumbent Prime Minister, that these type of charges are used and developed in a particular way. I mean, we don't see this in many other countries, and we don't see this issue being used in the same degree in terms of questions of sodomy and corruption. These are the other things that is being ironically used originally in 1998, 1999. The idea that the opposition leader was actually corrupt, again attempting to reduce the moral high ground and his political support.
Okay, Chandra, you were trying to say something there. Just quickly go ahead.
Yes. No, I think 2 points, Kamahl. Number one, there have been other, even more serious challenges to the Prime Minister in the 1990s, to Dr. Mahathir bin Mohamad. He was almost defeated by Tunku Razali Hamza in a contest some years ago, and he was not charged. Razali was not charged for sodomy or for homosexual activities and so on. So there have been challenges in Malaysian politics far more serious than the challenge that Anwar offered. Don't forget that when Anwar was sacked from the party, not a single divisional leader came out, not a single member of parliament, not a single minister followed suit. In the case of Razali, 6 cabinet ministers followed him. And that was a real severe challenge to Mahathir bin Mohamad. So I don't think one should generalize, which is what Bridget has done. Malaysian politics is very, very colorful. It's got many, many dimensions to it. I think there is a political dimension. It was clearer in 1998. I was with Anwar at that time, I know. We were all very concerned about it. But I think Dr. Mahathir was also concerned about what he saw as a major moral flaw in Anwar. And Mahathir has been very concerned about people who are supposed to have certain propensities, if one is to put it very mildly.
Okay, let's get a quick right of reply from Nurul before we move on. Nurul, what Chandra was saying before was very specific, and he was talking about things like your father not giving a DNA sample, like not answering the accusations directly in court. How do you respond to that? Because that's what it comes down to in the end. You can talk about political motivation, which is fair enough, but there was also a legal process, a court process, which your father could have used.
I think it's very difficult for me here, listening to the answers given by someone who's helming the organization that's being funded by the government. That's one. And number two, when you talk about the issue of DNA sample, you have to also address the legacy that we have inherited from the UMNO government, whether it's from the fact that he was beaten by the police chief under police custody the night of his arrest, to the fact that his DNA was stolen from him when he was detained in the lockup. You are looking at instances and episodes of malicious handling by the authorities that we're supposed to trust. And you want to mention the fact that, offering DNA samples and so on and so forth. For me, it's very difficult not to get emotional here. I have really seen the institutions of democracy in this country, whether it's the courts, whether it's the police force, being used merely to ensure Anwar Ibrahim remains behind bars. And it's not just him, mind you. You talk about this whole instance where this case was brought to the fore. Saiful, the person who made this allegation, actually met up with the Prime Minister prior to the charge being preferred against Anwar. And all these things were not explained by the government. We actually went to the point of trying to get witnesses. What happened? The main witnesses who were with Anwar at the time of the incident were extremely seriously harassed by the police. So certainly, I think I remain confident by the fact that there are many human rights organizations. We are having legitimacy in terms of proceeding our case, not because I happen to be the daughter, because we have really worked alongside human rights organizations and seriously looked at the merits and the biased conduct of the judges in the various proceedings that we have gone through.
Okay.
So,
Nurul,
I'm
going to jump in there, Nurul. I'm sorry. I just am conscious of time, and there are some other things I do want to talk about. And it's something related to what you've mentioned, and I really want to clarify this for our viewers, is the Malaysian law in this case. Because although 61% of Malaysia's population is Muslim, this case is not an issue to do with Islamic law. Yes, there are elements of Islamic law used in Malaysia, but this actually comes under an article in the Constitution that allows for what we call a dual law system. Anwar, however, has been charged under a rarely used section of the Criminal Code, which is not related to Islamic law. Bottom line here is that sodomy in Malaysia is illegal. Bridget, I've got a question for you about the law, but do you just want to have a quick right of reply to what Chandra said? Just briefly, please.
Yes, I think that, in the case of the 1987 challenge by Tunku Razali to Mahathir, we clearly saw the judiciary being pulled into this, and it led to a judicial crisis in 1988. So I don't think that there is a pattern of that he suggests that I'm overgeneralizing. I do feel that at the very essence, when Mahathir was challenged and when leaders in power in Malaysia are challenged, we often see the institutions brought in to actually quell those challenges. And I think we saw that earlier in terms of the deregistration of UMNO in 1987, and we saw and the judicial crisis that came after that, and we've seen this in the 98, 97, 99 trial, and of course more recently in these three instances.
Okay then. Thank you for that. I want to bring in this what I was talking about the law before. I mean, Malaysia is a democracy. They have elections, but yet they have laws like this which clearly discriminate against parts of society. What about reform? Is there any sign of reform on the horizon? Is there enough pressure for that sort of thing to happen?
Well, I think the issue of reform has been at the center of most of these cases since 1997, 1998, to bring about political and economic reforms. Political reforms that involve expanding rights for different communities, making the system more open, more representative of different communities as a whole, more engaging to questions of good governance, more transparent. This has been at the center, and we've seen this consistently since that period of time. So most of the people that have won office, whether or not it's in the government or outside of the government, they have used a reform agenda or reformer label to legitimize themselves. But in terms of the issues of affecting questions of sodomy, that I think this is an area in the context of Malaysia that there has actually been very little reform. The Penal Code 377A is inherited from the British. It has been used in this particular case. But the conditions that homosexuals face in Malaysia have raised international attention in the human rights community, and not just the homosexual community, transgender community, and others. And this is something that I think is actually not reforming, and because there's a lot of conservative backlash against expanding rights in this particular area.
Chandra, what do you think there? I mean, I think Bridget raises a good point. That this law, was it 377, I think you said, Penal Code 377, inherited from the British. It goes back to colonial days. Why hang on to it in 2015 now, modern 21st century, where, yes, people are gay?
Yeah. Well, Kamahl, I think this is a law which has quite a bit of support within the populace, not just the Muslim segment of the national community, but I think quite a lot of the non-Muslims would also adopt a certain position vis-a-vis homosexuality and the way in which they perceive homosexuality as criminal and all the rest of it. But the critical point is this: why is it that Anwar Ibrahim, or Nurul Issah for that matter, anyone else in Parliament, has not made an attempt to get this law rescinded? Because this is something which Parliament has to do. It's not for the judiciary to decide on this. The judiciary interprets laws. But if you want to abrogate a law, it has to be Parliament. And yet Anwar has been silent as far as this law is concerned. And all the others have been very quiet about this law. Now, that's the way to go. If you want to reform this, you go to Parliament. You don't expect the judiciary to initiate actions of this sort because it's not within their province.
OK, well, let's ask Nurul Issah. Would you, any of your supporters, make attempts to change this sort of law? Even if you believe your father is not guilty of it, it is the thing which has put him behind bars. So are you making pushes for reform there?
I think political reform has been one of the main objectives of our movement from the very beginning. Hence the word reformasi when the struggle first began. But we looked at it clearly, more holistically. From the issue of being first charged with sodomy, we actually went through the Islamic courts trying to bring up the challenge through qazaf proceedings, which I don't have to expand here. But my point being, when you talk about reform, yes, we have been advocating for political reform, even legal reforms. And one of the key things that we looked at are archaic laws. And the focus has been on the Internal Security Act, which the Prime Minister eventually abolished, of course replaced with another arbitrary preventive detention act. And secondly, of course, the Sedition Act, which he promised to repeal. And when we talk about the prosecution against Anwar Ibrahim, I'm also saying that it is being coupled with other charges preferred against other members of Parliament using the Sedition Act, which the Prime Minister has went back against and decided to use against any form of dissent, especially from the opposition. So for me,
we're running out of time just now, and I wanted to get one final question to you just before we end the programme. How old is your father now?
He's 67.
67. So if he was in jail for the full 5 years, 72, do you think at 72 he would still have an appetite for politics?
I think he has made great gains in Malaysian political arena, and I don't see him as someone who will ever give up.
Bridget Welsh, what do you think about Anwar Ibrahim's future?
Well, I think every day that he stays in prison, he continues to be very politically important and for the context of Malaysian politics. Whether or not he can become Prime Minister is another question, but he still is important on the political scene.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I do thank you for your time today. It's been a very interesting discussion. Nurul Issah Anwar joined us. She is Anwar Ibrahim's daughter. Also, Chandra Muzaffar and Bridget Welsh, all joining us from Kuala Lumpur. I thank you very much for your time. And we thank you, of course, for joining us, our viewers. If you've got anything to add to today's show, plenty of ways in which you can do that. You can head to our programmes page at aljazeera.com, have a look at this episode again and post your comments there. You can also go to facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or if you prefer Twitter, very simple, go to @AJ Inside Story or me @KamalAJE. I am Kamahl Santamaria from the whole Inside Story team. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.